Our next speaker is Alexa Warwick. She is a wildlife engagement specialist and conservation biologist in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University, and a great partner of the Institute. I'm going to put it that way. She works jointly with MSU Extension and the Michigan DNR to develop, evaluate, and improve wildlife and conservation-related programs. Dr. Warwick also conducts research in amphibian ecology and human dimensions of wildlife. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Warwick. And hopefully you got a chance. I see most people have answered the question in Zoom. So I'm going to end that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And I'm going to share those results. It looks like about 54% have never owned a pet amphibian. You are missing out is what I have to say on that. But that's okay. 33% not currently, but have previously owned, and 13% yes, currently own. In terms of whether you've heard of the following amphibian pathogens, chytrid fungus, about 63% have heard of it. 65% have heard of, oh my goodness, you might have to pronounce that one.
Trachochytrium dendrobatitis. Yeah. BD.
Thank you.
Yeah.
BD. There you go. 38% have heard of
Batrachochytridium salamandrivorans, B-cell.
Thank you. And 56% have heard of ranaviruses, and 19% have heard of none of them. So hopefully you will learn a lot today. So I'm going to stop sharing that poll and hand it off to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invite, and thanks, Kyle, for making a great transition. If you were here for his talk a little bit ago, we just were getting a little bit of information on pet trade and chytrid fungus. So I'm going to be taking maybe a little bit of a different frame today around human dimensions. I do, as was mentioned, some kind of more typical natural science work on amphibian ecology. But today the focus is going to be on a pretty large project, and I want to make sure to acknowledge this huge team of people and principal investigators on this project across 5 different universities, including various undergrad, grad students, postdocs, and especially our industry partners that have been part of this process. It would not have been possible to have all of these people involved to have this work move forward. So I'll do a little bit of introduction around human dimensions research in case that's not a familiar term for some of you. I'll talk some more generally about wildlife trade and then how pathogens fit into that, and some more specific information about who the stakeholders are within the U.S. amphibian pet trade network. And we have a couple different projects moving forward and sort of some overall objectives and approaches we're using for that. It is in the works. So some interviews were done in 2020, some surveys in 2021, and then we got funded with a large NSF grant in 2022. So there's a lot more work coming down the line. So I will highlight a few things from our pilot survey and interviews, and then give you some next steps in case you might want to get involved or even know others who might want to get involved. Initially, just want to kind of pose this question and have you think a little bit about what those broad conservation challenges are for herps and probably for many other organisms as well, in addition to their ecosystems. And, if you sort of pause and think about that for a second, I'm going to make it a little bit easy for you by giving you some examples, but there are a lot of things that we are working on from a conservation standpoint. Invasive species, obviously, disease, climate change, habitat loss or fragmentation, lack of funding, a sense of mistrust for scientists or misunderstanding of science, that stakeholders have different cultures and values, and then that research doesn't always get implemented, that there's this gap in between what happens. And by looking across all of these challenges, you might notice a consistent theme, perhaps, and that would be humans. We are definitely a potential problem for, cause for some of these challenges, but we're also a solution. And so to better understand the human component of these systems is really critical to carry out conservation outcomes. So I'm going to emphasize that with that research implementation gap a little bit here. we might imagine that we have society and all the local knowledge, values, and behaviors and decision-making that happens, and problems kind of get sent over to science to then provide solutions. But this is more of a traditional model and doesn't value the components of society that actually are really critical to integrate. So that's what we mean by a gap here, and might mean that science research doesn't get implemented because it's not reflecting those societal values or even the barriers that might exist to implement those things. So maybe a better approach, or reframing conservation as more of a social science, social process that uses science, is engaging stakeholders earlier in the process, not just after research is completed, and making this part of kind of a collaborative governance in managing our natural resources. And it's sometimes referred to as community engaged research or participatory action research. And it's really getting at this idea that humans have a role to play. And if we ignore that, we may not be able to do as much than if we understand, forecast, and include them in that process. So that's really where I think human dimensions research is important. It is an interdisciplinary field, drawing on many different social science disciplines and theories and approaches. Sometimes you might have heard the term conservation social science is another way to refer to this. And it really is a focus on social science data to understand and forecast human thoughts, behaviors, and how those might influence conservation outcomes. And outreach and engagement are critical to this process as well in order to include those stakeholders in research and decision-making. So hopefully you have a little better sense of what I mean, sort of a framing around human dimensions. And for wildlife trade, as was referenced earlier, and I will bring it up again here, that disease is certainly a big challenge. And it's something that we're all maybe very intimately familiar with now after COVID. So it's certainly a way that's going to be spread through trade is kind of the expectation. And wildlife trade is a fairly large industry, over $300 billion annually, and 2 billion specimens per year. A third of them are live, so obviously not all trade happens with live animals. Over 1,000 species, almost 200 nations. So this is a pretty big industry. And high-income countries like the US and other European Union countries do drive market demand. So I'll show a couple figures here just to emphasize that. On the left, I've got a image that shows how trade flows, and most of that left-hand side is the US Fish and Wildlife Service regions for imports from other countries. And again, just to emphasize kind of the number of shipments over time on this right graph for US imports, you can see that it increased pretty dramatically in the 2000s. So, this is something that we need to be keeping in mind and considering as part of conservation efforts. And for amphibians specifically, those imports are about 1% of all wildlife trade, so certainly a smaller portion, and they are primarily frogs. So if we look at this figure here from a study in 2019 that looks across all in the red is all of amphibia, then which of those were anurans or frogs and toads, and it's about 99% with just a few salamanders in there. And then it breaks it down even further by families, and then you get almost over 500 species involved. And of those species, in the US, our imports are primarily bullfrogs for food purposes. And then the other half were pets. And I think many of you answered that you haven't owned pet amphibians before. So yeah, it's interesting. It's a small number. We don't know exactly how many people own pet amphibians, and that is something that our project is looking at as well. One other piece of information to go with this kind of continuing along here are the sources or the supply for those frogs. And you can see some of the top ones here: Nicaragua, Madagascar, Panama. And then again, where are they headed? The US is really the biggest one. So, we are a big importer of amphibian trade. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of programs or regulations that would support clean or healthy wildlife trade. Generally, there's certainly agricultural related programs, but not really focused on wildlife. And in this clean and healthy, we're referring to not having pathogens or disease. So what are those amphibian pathogens? Now, it sounded like some of you have already learned a bit, probably with Kyle's talk earlier today and maybe previous to this. So I'll just briefly go over kind of the three that I'll be mentioning today. BD, or Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, was discovered in the 90s, and it was responsible for more than 90 species extinction. So it was a pretty significant chytrid fungus that invaded a lot of locations, especially in the middle tropical areas. And we unfortunately have a related species that focuses on salamanders. BD was focused more on frogs, but Batrachochytrium salamandrivorans, or B-sal, was found in 2013 and is really an emerging threat. Ranaviruses have been around for a while, and they do infect amphibians, reptiles, and fish. But both BD and ranaviruses are global, whereas B-sal is only in Europe and Asia. And you can kind of get a sense by looking at some of these BD papers over the last 10 years or so about how BD has been found from trade and breeding programs throughout various parts of the world here, as well as ranavirus in this example, and then another BD example. So lots of concern that these pathogens are spreading through the pet trade, and examples of that here. And the expectation for B-sal is that it will enter the US or North America through the pet trade. So we are really concerned about how to prevent that. And there was a group formed in 2015 to address this emerging disease threat. And at the time, not as much was done with the pet trade industry as a partner. And previous efforts were really more regulatory. The US Fish and Wildlife Service listed about 200 species of salamanders as injurious under the Lacey Act. And that, of course, had implications for movement of animals across state lines and imports. So it's something that impacts businesses, and yet they weren't as involved in the process. So let's focus a bit more on those pet trade network or stakeholders. So focus back in on the pet trade network. And I sort of referenced these two primary pieces to it: businesses and pet owners. And we can break those down a little bit more, especially with businesses. There's importers, there's hobbyists that might be doing this more on the side. It's not their primary gig. There are breeders that, as it suggests, they're providing animals to maybe more retailers or even back to hobbyists or vice versa. So there's some networking that's happening among businesses within this pet trade industry. And we honestly don't have a lot of information around this. So that's kind of a big piece of our project, is to start to understand those connections. And then in turn, all of this is directed towards consumers, which in this case are those amphibian pet owners. For these kind of two groups, certainly disease is a concern because of profit loss for businesses, and for individual pet owners, you wouldn't want to lose your animal. You wouldn't want to add extra costs and expenses to caring for that animal. So this is something that businesses and pet owners do have a vested interest in addition to the concerns that I've sort of brought up previously, that spread of these pathogens into natural ecosystems called spillover. That's something that we're really trying to avoid, especially in the US with B-sal, because we have a high number of endemic salamanders in the US. So if B-sal does enter, and then maybe someone cleans their tank and it gets washed into the water bodies, or somebody walks out with their pet animal and has some of those pathogens spread that way, this is a big concern and something that we want to avoid, because once it's there, it will be almost impossible to eradicate, as we've seen from previous chytrid fungus examples like BD. So our project, with all of the people that I referenced earlier, is really taking kind of 4 overall objectives or approaches to this. The big one is to model the pathogen dynamics across this network, and that requires all the rest of this information. So characterizing the network, having a better understanding of who's involved, how many what the particular components are of movement of animals between, is it primarily hobbyists, is it breeders, those kinds of questions, as well as the actual amount of pathogen that is spread currently. So BD and ranavirus are most likely to be found through surveillance as part of characterizing the network. But it's possible that we may be the first to find BSAL through this project. And so we are thinking a lot about what does that look like to have a response. And then number 3, for quantifying values and strategies, that's really the emphasis on stakeholders, and that's what I'll focus on today. And then finally, having some additional estimates about how pathogens might be amplified within the various characteristics of this network. So taking some examples and doing some in-house studies on how does that spread take place, say within a particular cage, et cetera. So again, I'll focus more on these quantifying stakeholder values and strategies piece, because these are, really critical for these kind of players in this network. And industry has a number of actions they can take, values they might hold that would influence whether pathogens are spread or not. And the same with consumers, sort of why they might choose an animal, what they might do with that animal in terms of disposal, as well as, healthy practices and how they value that are really important. And the kind of piece I don't have on here yet would be the government, and agencies, all kinds of agencies from state to federal have a role to play in this as well. So we are including them in this values and strategies process too. And kind of the piece that I won't have time to say much on, but we are doing additional research, is visitors to natural areas. And, if there's value to amphibians, as well as value to preventing spread and what kind of actions people might take. So I'm not going to focus on that piece today, but just know that is another area we're doing work on. So for the rest of this time, I'm just going to go through 2 sets of projects within this. One from my current master's student, who was an undergrad when she did work on this, and sort of was the impetus for much of this project from an independent study that she wanted to do, and then led to me contacting and connecting with these other collaborators and submitting the NSF grant. And then when the NSF grant wasn't initially funded, we got some pilot funding, and I believe Ellen shared those in the chat as if anyone wants to check those out. So we have a pilot study and then the current project. So I'll go over Gia's initial interviews and then a little bit on the pilot study and wrap up with where things are headed next. So she used interviews because we don't know very much about this particular group. It's really helpful to start with a little more open-ended questions. And so she recruited, fortunately, right as the pandemic was starting, so it was a little more challenging, but addressed questions about their knowledge of BSAL, biosecurity practices, how do they help prevent disease within their own individual animals, perceptions of management actions that could be taken to help prevent BSAL, and then the structure itself, how are they communicating with others in the network? What sort of sources do they value to get their information? And so again, this was initially just trying to get some information across a range of potential stakeholders like pet owners, which was her primary focus, and then some additional individuals that might be involved like veterinarians, pet store owners, wildlife rehabilitators were also recruited through this process. So I'll mention a couple points and then shift to the pilot survey. Just know there's a lot more than this, but we don't have enough time to dive too deeply. Almost 70% had knowledge of BSAL, and they mentioned things about, some of the die-offs in Europe, mortality rate, that it's a skin disease, not in the US right now, has Asian origin, and it's spreading. And, maybe surprisingly, that about 23% mentioned that they examined their amphibians' health in the context of looking for BSAL. And then very few have tested their animals for BSAL, which is unsurprising because it is currently difficult to do that. So you would need to have access to a lab that is testing that, which, as I'll talk about later, we're hoping to change that. And they mentioned some other biosecurity practices like limiting their handling and disinfecting equipment, quarantining new animals, and other housing measures that they might use. And Gia was especially interested in looking at the management action preferences, and that the individuals that she talked to were really focused on actions that did not directly impact environments. So things like price changing or limiting access to natural areas, genetic research or testing for BSAL, versus some other things that were maybe addressing BSAL management directly in the environment. And these were all based on their potential management action attitudes around they cared for the environment, they cared for salamanders, and they had to think about their own practical effectiveness in their livelihood. So there were a number of things that she had from that particular interview that then in turn helped inform our pilot survey. And this was led by Neelam Pudyal at the University of Tennessee and his postdoc, Kevin Casavos. And they used an anonymous survey with input from the full team, as well as our industry partners, that launched in 2021. So we had recruitment similarly, email, online, but also through our industry partnerships going to trade shows. Had about 100 businesses and almost 400 consumers respond. And those questions focused, again, on characteristics of the businesses, especially knowledge, biosecurity and husbandry practices. And then because Neelam focuses on some economic components, and this is something we were very interested in, given the interest that businesses likely would have from a profit perspective, what's the willingness to pay for clean trade or these certified pathogen-free amphibians? So what did we find from these pilot surveys? Well, for businesses, very few were importing amphibians from outside the US. Most of them only did domestic transactions, and some weren't sure. So that's where we would expect from the international trade some of those novel pathogen introductions. And then from the domestic trade, that's going to play a role in whether the pathogens get amplified. So things that are already here, like BD and ranavirus. And they did get their amphibians and sell their amphibians primarily to hobbyists and breeders. And then obviously for selling them to households directly, that was also a big option. So this hobbyist piece is kind of an important one, given how often it comes up in both acquiring and selling, and is one that's much more difficult to capture because these folks are probably not doing this as their primary activity. And so finding them is certainly going to be a challenge in the future. Most of the businesses did mention use of disinfectants and disposable gloves and quarantining. So some good practices already in place. A few, again, kind of similar to what Gia saw, few of them are testing them. So this would be an important outreach component that we're thinking about. And, 3/4 don't decontaminate their wastewater or other aquarium content. So that, again, could be a pathway for spillover. And they were generally very willing to or interested in acquiring amphibians from a pathogen-free or certification program. So you can see, most of them consider that to be extremely important. And a lot of them had very high amounts of response to, or high response to saying, this is important to me to have it be a pathogen-free facility, and that it will be profitable and it's helpful for the public image of my business. So they even said that they would pay up to 20% more for pathogen-free amphibians. So again, I think this suggests that we can move forward with some of these ideas on a certification program. And very briefly, from the consumer side, some similar information that Gia found previously too, these are a little more educated folks that are owning pet amphibian consumers from this pilot study, and they're getting information from a lot of different places, but interestingly, many of them said scientific journals in that too, so probably reflects their higher levels of education. And many of them are getting their animals from online retailers as well as in-store retailers or pet stores. And the hobbyist was not quite as high for this particular group. And then finally, back to this price piece, on average, they're paying about $50. And it did show that they were willing to pay more. I'll get to that in a second here, but they were willing to pay more for their animal to be certified. Just a few other points to make per death and disposal. 80% of them said they had a pet amphibian die and that some would bury it or place it in the garbage. Fewer, fortunately, not very many left it outdoors, which we were glad to see, or flushing it down the toilet. So understanding what their habits and behaviors are already is really important to think about those outreach components. And then some, did give it away. A few reported euthanizing it or returning it to an amnesty program. Okay, so what are some of the key takeaways here? Well, it seems that businesses and consumers are aware of pathogen threats, and especially consumers, though, need to be more informed about biosecurity practices. Both groups were willing to participate and place value on acquiring pathogen-free amphibians. So businesses were willing to pay a bit more, 20%. Consumers were willing to pay quite a bit more, 77%. And so overall, we estimated that this would be something like a 26% increased profit margin to sell pathogen-free amphibians. So this has really led us to working towards some industry-led, market-supported healthy trade certification programs. In 2022, I helped facilitate a number of discussions with a much larger group of industry stakeholders to talk through what would this actually look like if we were to implement this certification program. Who's going to manage it? Who's going to do the surveillance and testing? And then in turn, that outreach and education around biosecurity practices, what can we do to better support that for consumers and for businesses? So continued efforts on this development and implementation of a healthy trade certification program for pet amphibians. We are doing a broader survey effort now that we have secured additional funds for the NSF grant. And this is really going to focus on components of this certification program. So what things might be a barrier to people? Why wouldn't they want to be involved? What could we do to make this easier to uptake? Those kinds of things. And if you know somebody or you are a pet owner, as some of you were, feel free to join our list. Those surveys will go out in May. And then we are also looking for state, federal, tribal agency professionals who could be involved in focus groups and interviews, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we need to have all of these stakeholders involved in this process. And with that, I'll just again reference the many people involved in this project and thank my funding sources for my own work, the DNR and MSU Extension, as well as our NSF grant and our pilot funding through the One Health Initiative at University of Tennessee. And thank you all for having me today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing in more of a social science perspective. We don't always get that, and I really appreciate it. I did put the links that she had in her slide. I know it's QR codes, but I did put them in both our chat on Facebook as well as on Zoom. So you will be getting a follow-up email with those links as well. So if you can't capture them now, don't worry about it. You have an opportunity to get involved as well. We do have a question in the Q&A, and feel free to type in your questions in the chat Q&A. We'll get to them. But the question that we have right now is, we often have teachers who use frogs for dissection. Often these K-12 schools don't always dispose of the frogs in the best way due to financial restrictions and lack of access to scientific disposal services. Do you think these dissection frogs present a risk for disease transmission into the community?
I think that's a great question. And probably, yes. I think that they very much could be one of those sources of disease transmission. And we've had this come up in other conversations or presentations I've given, that as you start thinking about the trade piece and other ways in which these animals are being used, there's so much to be done. There's so many places that we could be thinking about how to improve those practices and prevent spread. So I think that's a really important piece. And I would love to have, maybe I can get an undergrad who could focus a bit on that piece of it, because we've been so focused on this industry piece. And as you saw earlier in the talk, there's a high number of bullfrogs coming in for food, but also other animals that are being spread across the US and raised and used in dissections in classrooms. So yeah, many places. I've had people mention too, zoos, that's another area of potential spread. So many spots we could focus on. I wish we could get it all done in the same swoop, but I think this project in particular might be a good model to think about how could we, address this in other contexts as well. But not much is known. So I would definitely think that's the case, that's a point of spread, but nobody's looked at it as far as I know.
We have someone joining us on Facebook saying 6 of us here in Ontario work as park rangers. We have cleaning stations of invasive plants at trailheads. But if you were to recommend ideas for protected areas, what might be you suggest we think about? We realize this is different than the current study, more industry, but
yeah, so we actually have some other research that we're doing in this pilot study. Again, I couldn't talk about much of that today, but that was focused on visitors to natural areas and looking at like, what is it that will help visitors actually do those behaviors that we're hoping for, and what kinds of things are they thinking about? So I probably can't pull off the top of my head without listing off a long range, but I'm happy to follow up, or I can pop my email in the chat. I realized I didn't have that up here. But I would be glad to respond to some of those questions with some more detail than probably could provide off the top of my head right now. But we did look at that in a couple natural areas specifically, and I would love to share more.
And I can also put your email in the chat, so don't worry about that. And I know everyone that's joining us on Zoom, you'll get a follow-up email with also her email, so that'll help you, so you don't have to get everything right now. So I want to thank you so much for opening our eyes, and it's great to see some people are willing to pay more as well, which I know is not always the case. So thank you for bringing this in. Oh, we had one more question, quick run in if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be most effective to look into the threat of disease transmission through the biological companies that supply the frogs for education? I think this is in reference to the previous question.
Yeah, I think that could get you to more of a direct source instead of trying to track down, where is the initial disease pathogen really coming from? And the piece that would go with that is, not every supplier probably is, as we've encountered with trade, not everyone's a great player, and we can't control everybody's actions in that regard, but it could be a dual piece of helping educate and provide things like certification for those suppliers to classrooms, and in classrooms helping educate, what do you do with those animals after you're done that would help prevent spread into natural areas. So yeah, I think there's a huge piece in there that I would love to explore more, and we'll see. Maybe that'll be the next NSF grant.
I like how you think. Awesome. All right.